I have the privilege and the honor to moderate a panel today about abuse in nursing homes. And let me start off by giving a brief introduction to our panelists here in no particular order. The first is Dr. Laura Mosqueda. I think she is, she's right there, she's coming up to the podium, the table. She's actually the Dean of the Keck School of Medicine at the University of Southern California, as well as a professor of family medicine and geriatrics at the University of Southern California Leonard Davis School of Gerontology. Prior to her appointment, Dr. Mosqueda served as Associate Dean of Primary Care and the Chair of Family Medicine. And she's actually one of the world-renowned expert and researcher in this area, in the area of elder abuse and neglect. And she's also the Director of National Center on Elder Abuse, a almost $3 million federally funded initiative that focuses on information regarding policy, research, training, and resources related to neglect and exploitation of older adults. And she provides information on policymakers, professionals, and the public. And I think she's a frequent expert providing testimony to Congress in this regard. And she also volunteers as a long-term care ombudsman. Next person is Sandra Sands, Senior Counsel, U.S. Department of Homeland, HHS, Health and Human Services. She's well over there. The Office of the Inspector General. Sandra's a Senior Counsel in the HHS OIG. She worked for the Inspector General since 1989, and she focused on a wide range of issues, including fraud and abuse in nursing homes and access to care through hospital and emergency room departments. She has taught at Georgetown Law Schools, a Women's Law and Public Policy Fellow, and clerk for federal and state judges, including Chief Justice of the California Supreme Court, Rose Bird. She focuses on public benefits in elder law and includes improving the quality of care in nursing homes. And she received her undergraduate degree from Cornell and her law degree from the University of California. And Robin Grant, who's my left, she's the Director of Public Policy and Advocacy at the National Consumer Voice for Quality Long-Term Care. Ms. Grant is the Director of, she is actually responsible for leading the development and implementation of Consumer Voice's public policy agenda and growing and mobilizing the grassroots network to support the organization's policy work. Before joining Consumer Voice, she served as the Long-Term Care Policy Director at United Senior Action and as a consultant with the National Long-Term Care Ombudsman Resource Center. She holds a master's degree in social work with specialization on aging. And she was the Indiana State Long-Term Care Ombudsman for 8 years and president of the National Association of State Long-Term Care Ombudsman Program for 2 terms. In addition, she served on the Consumer Voices Board of Directors. Next to her is Dr. Susan Lynch, who's the Senior Counsel for Elder Justice in the Department of Justice. At the Department of Justice over the past few decades, she led civil healthcare fraud prosecutions against long-term care providers for failure to adequately care for their residents. Dr. Lynch is a national lead for the Department Elder Justice Task Force nationwide, the Attorney General Bill Barr referenced, and is the department's subject matter expert on nursing homes and home health agency fraud. She received her BA from Dartmouth, JD from Indiana University School of Law, the Mars School of Law. She has an LLM in Master's Law from Georgetown University Law Center. She received a doctorate in health leadership and management from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. And she volunteers her time on weekends as a paramedic. Okay. David Bundy, who is the Deputy Director for Criminal Enforcement, the Medicaid Fraud Control Unit at the Florida Office of the Attorney General. I think that's referred to as MUFUCU. He joined the Attorney General's office in 2006. And in 2011, he was named Regional Chief of the Central Florida region for MUFUCU. And last year, he was appointed to the Attorney General Ashley Moody's Senior Protection Team. This year, he's named the Deputy Director of Criminal Enforcement for MUFUCU. In this role, he serves as the legal advisor to law enforcement for the state of Florida's MUFUCU. He received his JD from Catholic University and a JD from Catholic University Columbus School of Law in 2000. I think I have everybody. Great. So why don't we start off by putting the, laying out kind of the law of the land here. And I want to ask I actually want to ask a general question to Dr. Mosqueda about kind of the population of elderly citizens that we have in the United States that are currently living in nursing homes, and more specifically, kind of what is their overall health status?
Well, we have probably around 1.5 million people who live in nursing homes. Most people who live in nursing homes are older adults. And generally, if you're living in a nursing home, it's because you are having significant physical and or cognitive issues. So we tend to see high rates of what we call frailty, people who are having difficulty and need a lot of assistance with daily living kinds of activities, and people who often have different types of cognitive impairment. It could be something like Alzheimer's disease or other types of illnesses that cause problems with memory and thinking.
Is that, to follow up on that, are those some of the changes that come along with aging?
Yes, those are common age-related changes, but not necessarily normal. So it's important to distinguish that having something like Alzheimer's disease is common, but that doesn't make it normal. Very important for people to understand that so that we don't overly accept things like pain and memory loss as, well, it's just because I'm old, when oftentimes it is due to something that can be treated and reversed.
Now, I know you focus your research area on identifying markers for abuse. Could you kind of tell us some of the findings that you made?
Yeah, and it gets back to one of the things you just mentioned before, is what happens with aging, right? So as we get older, our skin becomes thinner, our bones become a little less dense, there's changes in our heart and our kidneys, and all of these things make us not only susceptible to issues such as over-medication, but also when something happens, like an older adult gets hit, or sexually assaulted, or pushed, that we have this tendency to say, well, of course they have a broken bone, they're old. Of course they have a bruise, they're old. Of course they have a skin tear, pressure sore, fill in the blank, they're old. And that's why it's important to do research, which the Department of Justice through the National Institute of Justice has really supported, on issues such as markers. So we, for example, have done studies to say, well, it is true that when we're older, we bruise more easily. However, bruising can also be evidence of abuse or neglect. And so we've done some research to try to figure out how can you distinguish some of the characteristics of a bruise that might make it more likely to be due to an abusive situation rather than due to an accident. And I'll point out that in one of the rooms in the back, resource table, there's a variety of resources available that talk about abuse and neglect, and specifically on this bruising study as well. I have colleagues actually at Cornell who are looking at how can you distinguish when things like broken bones or fractures are due to abuse and neglect versus an accident.
Now, you referenced kind of WE. I know you're also the director of National Center on Elder Abuse. Can you tell us a little bit more about that organization and the work that it does?
The National Center on Elder Abuse is a federally funded organization that we have at the Keck School of Medicine of University of Southern California, and it is a resource for the country. What we do is comb through legitimate research and try to translate it into English, along with a lot of other languages, so that information that gets into scientific journals also becomes useful for people in the lay public. We have great colleagues, for example, at the Consumer Voice, with whom we work in order to get information out on things like fraud, abuse, and neglect in long-term care facilities. So we are your national resource center.
Now, one of the issues that we hear a lot about in law enforcement and in policy is kind of this over-hospitalization or having elderly citizens going to hospitals for unnecessary reason. What are some of the reasons why that you're seeing through your research and the work you do on these type of unnecessary hospitalizations of nursing home patients?
Yeah, there's a variety of things that happen in nursing homes. No nursing home wants to have high rates of mortality of people dying in their nursing home. So some nursing homes will send somebody out as quickly as possible when they realize they're toward end of life, so that they die in the hospital and not in the nursing home, and it doesn't get reported as such. Some do unnecessary things like cardiopulmonary resuscitation in somebody who doesn't really want it, and they end up calling paramedics and get sent into the hospital. Same thing that can happen with poor quality of care, for example, for people who may end up with pneumonia or pressure sores. I certainly don't want to imply that this happens everywhere. It doesn't. There are some very excellent nursing homes around, but it is wonderful to hear that the Department of Justice and colleagues at Health and Human Services are taking real action against some of the worst of the worst.
Mm-hmm. And as a medical practitioners, could you tell us a little bit about kind of the things that the physicians do to detect, particularly things like multidisciplinary teams to kind of detect elder abuse?
Yes, I'm embarrassed to say that as physicians we don't do enough. We don't get enough training in care of older adults. We don't do a good enough job serving as medical directors in nursing homes. But we're making real efforts to improve what we know and teach and how we practice medicine on behalf of older adults. We're also really pushing for the use of what are called multidisciplinary teams, as you mentioned, because even though we artificially separate people into medical problems, legal problems, social service problems, and even in medicine, right, it's, well, I only take care of your heart and I only take care of your lungs, and sometimes I joke around with the orthopedists that they're specializing in left knees versus right knees these days. The question is, how do we put Humpty together again? So how do we take a holistic approach? And particularly for people who may have been victimized, it often involves very complicated, as we've heard, complicated situations. And so bringing together people who serve older adults in the community, and that means physicians, psychologists, social services, criminal justice, et cetera, bringing people together in the same room at the same time can help us move more effectively and more efficiently toward stopping bad things and hopefully toward protection.
Mm-hmm. How do you think, in your opinion, how do we improve kind of the quality of care in nursing homes? And I guess the byproduct of that is to kind of remove abuse and those type of situations in nursing homes. Any suggestions?
Yeah, and part of this now will become, is part of what I've seen as a volunteer long-term care ombudsman, where I just go into a nursing home and sit with an older adult. I'm not a geriatrician or a physician, a physician who specializes in elder abuse. I'm just sitting with older adults. I think we have forgotten that older adults, whether they have dementia or not, no matter how frail they are people. And we have failed to recognize and respect and treasure the humanity of all people, no matter what their age and no matter what their functional status. And as soon as we do that, it allows us to treat these important members of our society as less than human. So I think at a very basic level, that's a very important issue that all of us can help work on. On the more practical side, we certainly need to have staff who are better paid, better trained, and better valued for the important work they do caring for our loved ones. I think we need to, it's great to have websites where people can identify problems, but the question then is, what do we do about it? Are we taking appropriate action when bad things are happening? And it might be one thing to go and shut a bad nursing home down, but then where do those people go who are living there? What happens to them? What happens when people are evicted from nursing homes because they're, quote, behavior problems? When we don't have creative solutions to caring for people who are in such distress that they're having what we perceive as behavior problems, and we're not just medicating them in order to soothe ourselves. What are we doing to recognize the humanity of the older adults so that we're providing loving care and holding accountable those people who don't provide appropriate staffing and appropriate training for those staff? Occasionally there's a bad egg. There's a nursing assistant who is a predator and who perpetrates things like sexual assault. We absolutely want to do something about that. And we also need to do something about some of the owners of nursing homes who don't provide appropriate salary, wages, training, and circumstances that would allow the people who work there to do the jobs that they're supposed to be doing.
Well, those are very good policy questions. I think that's a great transition into questions for Robin here. Robin, I know you work for the National Consumer Voice for quality long care. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what the organization does, and I want to focus a little bit later on particularly the ombudsman work that you do. Okay.
So how do I? It's on. Okay, super. So I work for the National Consumer Voice for Quality Long-Term Care. So we're a national nonprofit organization, and we do public policy advocacy on behalf of nursing home residents, assisted living facility residents, and individuals who are receiving services at home. So we do that in a number of ways. We lobby members of Congress to get laws that are really responsive to the needs of long-term care consumers. So we push for laws to benefit and improve the quality of care and quality of life that they're receiving. We also work with many federal agencies like Department of Health and Human Services, Department of Justice, and many others. Again, to get policies that work for residents and give them the best quality of life that they can. So we do it through policy work. We also do a lot of education. So I would encourage you to check out our resource table, but also to go to our website. We have lots and lots of information there, because our goal is to educate and empower consumers. So people know what good nursing home care is. They know what their rights are. They know what to do if there's a problem, and they can speak up and advocate on their own behalf. Lastly, you're hearing a lot about the long-term care ombudsman this morning, but we operate the National Long-Term Care Ombudsman Resource Center, and that is funded through the Administration on Aging, and it provides technical assistance and support and training and resources to the literally thousands of long-term care ombudsmen around the country. So we help support and equip them to do their advocacy work.
Let me dive in a little bit more about that. What role does the ombudsman play, and exactly kind of what do they do, and what kind of resource can they be for patients?
I think the long-term care ombudsman is the best kept secret in this country, and I think we need it to no longer be a secret. I think, to put it very simply, the ombudsman is an advocate for residents of long-term care facilities. They're there to go to bat for the resident. They are on the resident's side. So they, first of all, each state has to have an ombudsman program. Are there any ombudsmen in this room? Okay, I want to give a big shout out to all the ombudsmen. Because when someone talks to me about a problem they're having in a nursing home, the absolute first response is, you need to go talk to your long-term care ombudsman. They are the go-to people in terms of issues, concerns, complaints you have related to nursing homes and assisted living facilities. So they do their advocacy in many different ways. The major role they have is to resolve complaints, and no complaint is too small, and so they handle complaints from, I'm not able to get up in the morning when I want to, and I've always been an early bird, all the way up to very serious complaints of bad quality of care. So they will look into the problem, and then they very specifically work to resolve the complaint in a way that is satisfactory to the resident. So they're guided by what the resident wants. So they are there to be the voice of, advocate with, or on behalf of residents. So this is particularly important, I can't stress this enough, because there are residents who don't have any family or friends to visit or to help. And the ombudsman may literally be the only person that a resident has contact with outside of the nursing home, who they see and they trust with their concerns. So their role is absolutely vital. They do a range of other things as well. They do a lot of education about rights. They provide education to residents, families, nursing home staff, the public. They provide information about what nursing homes are available and what to look for in a nursing home. They also do work on a systems level. So they're there for the individual resident, so individual advocacy, but they also are there to try to improve the system itself. So they're advocating for improvements in the laws and the regulations that really make a difference. And a way that they do some of that systems advocacy work is they partner with other state agencies and programs like the Medicaid Fraud Control Unit, Department of Justice, Adult Protective Services, the State Survey Agency, and they serve on task force and advisory groups. And so they're there basically to ensure that residents get the quality of care, quality of life, and rights to which they're entitled and that they deserve, each and every resident. So they're there for one resident, they're there across the country for all residents nationwide.
Okay. And I know that one of the agencies that you work closely with is the state of Florida, the Attorney General's office. And the question to David, you're kind of the Deputy Director of the Criminal Enforcement of Mafuku, which I think that unit exists in every state. Can you tell us a little bit about the work that the unit does and you and also your colleagues across the country?
Sure. So it's a little misnomer because we're Medicaid Fraud Control Unit, but so what we do, we have pain teams. So each state, I believe I think there's 49 states that have them. Others have, I think there may be one last holdout. But so almost every state and all the territories have a Medicaid Fraud Control Unit. And what it does, it has a patient abuse, neglect, and exploitation team within that. So it's not just fraud, it's actually specific to patient abuse, neglect, and exploitation in facilities that receive Medicaid funding. So a lot of what we do and the counterparts across the country do is, so there may be an abuse situation that a local police department or sheriff's office is called to, someone may be arrested, that person would be prosecuted as if that same event occurred anywhere else. The facts are the same, someone was hit, there's witnesses. We get a lot of the cases, which we talked about a little bit earlier, where we get a call, this person has a broken bone, there are no witnesses, we don't know why. And so we have medical investigators on staff, we also have prosecutors that this is all that they prosecute, so it's all they do. So they are used to seeing the signs. Thousands of complaints come in, and so to review those, people have to have that history of dealing with this to kind of know, at least generally, is this something that probably isn't a crime, or is this something that may be a crime we need to investigate more, or this is something that we need to get that person out of that facility now. We may already have probable cause for an arrest. So that's kind of what the Medicaid Fraud Control Unit does in each state. It's a kind of a specialized unit within the fraud unit of Medicaid Fraud Control that deals just with those particular issues.
Sure. Can you share with us some facts related to some cases that your office has worked on and that may actually demonstrate some of the trends that you may be seeing in nursing homes?
Sure. So I'll split this in two different ways. So there's the care staff. We talked about predators or people who are abusing elders because of that's in their DNA, that's what they're doing. And then there's systematic kind of abuse that I kind of call the corporate abuse, where it's more of a neglect. So some of the things that we see are chemical restraints. So if someone's having to be taken care of for so long, instead of actually taking care of the person, they will drug them so they're not being bothered anymore. Over a period of time, that can become neglect, and they can have medical issues that will come from that action. One case that is very unique is someone came in because they broke a hip they weren't in a nursing facility, but they went into one for rehabilitation. Well, this person was pretty active, and apparently, according to the people who were working there, it was kind of a pain because they didn't want to just sit in a bed and watch TV. They wanted to go out and do things. So they chemically restrained him. The daughter got involved about 3 or 4 months later, and he had ulcers, had all kinds of different neglect type issues medically. However, she took him home, and within 2 weeks, he was up moving around. So for those months that he was in the rehabilitation facility, this is someone who was hanging Christmas lights right before, is now being chemically restrained to a bed, not getting proper nutrition. So that's a case of neglect. They weren't physically abusing the person, but the lack of care systematically turned into a neglect case. The other part that we see, so in a lot of states, we have what's called it's a RUG score, which is basically what needs to be provided for this resident and then how much care is going to be provided. Florida has what we call a care plan. So every individual in a Florida nursing home has a care plan that should be followed. So what happens in Florida is there's a per diem rate. And so some of the cases we're seeing now is there may be nursing homes where people don't even have a care plan. So let's just, if things come up, there's nowhere to go. So it's kind of back when Florida years ago did, the Bill of Rights for nursing home residents, those type of things. That's kind of where this care plan drew out of. And so what we're seeing now is certain nursing homes may not be following the care plan, may not have an adequate care plan, or may not have one at all. And so I'll flip this back into our title of our unit, Medicaid Fraud Control Unit. That actually then turns into not only a possible neglect case, but it's fraud, because the government money is being paid to provide services that aren't being provided. So one, they're stealing money from the government, and two, and worstly, they're neglecting the most vulnerable patients in our society.
I know that your work relates closely with what the Department of Justice does, and I want to direct the attention to Susan. Susan, can you tell us a little bit about the work kind of the Department of Justice plays in this area, and also maybe give us some examples of some of the enforcement actions that we've taken?
Sure, and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for coming. So I'm going to talk about 2 different types of cases: Civil False Claims Act cases and criminal cases that the department has brought against nursing homes that provide grossly substandard care to their residents. And I can tell you, there's basically 3 types of problems we see in these cases. One is horrendous care, horrendous clinical care that leads to really bad resident suffering. The second is really gross physical plant, or in other words, the buildings that these residents are forced to live in are horrendous. And then finally, there's this third piece, which is where the owners, operators, or corporations in these nursing homes are siphoning the funds and basically stealing from the residents. These are the grossly substandard care facts that we see. And I can tell you that these cases really take a village to prosecute and bring to justice. We need everybody at this table and in this room to help us with these cases. Federal and state law enforcement, our advocacy groups, emergency medical services. We need our law enforcement, ombudsman, adult protective services. These cases, while complicated, are critical, and we need all of us to come together. So I'm going to talk about 3 different cases, because I think each of them have a different message for us today in terms of the work that we do. So the first is a case against the Vanguard facilities that Attorney General Barr referred to earlier today. And this is in the Middle District of Georgia. And we brought this case in partnership with the Medicaid Fraud Control Unit in the Middle District, I should say, of Tennessee. This was a case where the department ultimately recovered $18 million in allowed claims in bankruptcy, and importantly, ended up with something called a corporate integrity agreement, which my colleague Sandra Sands will talk about later. But for shorthand now, it's basically an agreement that HHS has with that corporation where over a period of 5 years, they come in and they really make a difference in terms of overseeing the quality. So let me tell you a little bit about the problems at Vanguard. I sometimes am asked, what are the biggest problems you see in a nursing home today? And I say there are basically 3. They're staffing, and they're staffing. And that's at the root of a lot of these problems that you hear, and many of you can identify with that. There were some particular problems in this nursing facility to sort of highlight. One was problems with infection control. And certainly we all know today infection control is a critically important issue. Pain medication, if we don't get our pain medication, then we're left to suffer. And then finally, the prevention of pressure ulcers. Pressure ulcers are terrible wounds, they're very painful, and they rely on staff because somebody must turn and reposition a resident on a regular basis if they sadly can't reposition themselves. So in this particular case, there were a lot of problems, and we were able to bring this organization to justice and also to bring a civil action against the CEO and COO of operations. One important lesson in this Vanguard case is that Vanguard filed for bankruptcy early on in the process. And so we at the Department of Justice with our colleagues followed them into the bankruptcy court and still brought them to justice. So companies that file for bankruptcy do not escape justice from the Department of Justice. The second case I want to talk about, and Vijay, one of your colleagues, brought this case in the Northern District of Georgia. This was Glenn Baker. And this was a criminal case where the prosecutor charged conspiracy to commit healthcare fraud and tax fraud, both personal income tax and employee tax fraud. And in this particular case, there was a gentleman who was an owner, who was educated, a law school educated person, who owned 3 facilities in the Northern District of Georgia. And this case really is the gold standard for grossly substandard care. And in this particular facility, there were a number of major problems. The first was lack of food. And I mean lack of food. Some of the photos of the individuals looked completely emaciated. I can tell you that in the evidence at trial, it was said that this facility and this owner spent $1.83 per day on the food for each resident. And I mean, you know, $1.83 will not even get you a Starbucks, okay? That is horrendous, and these people suffered. Secondly, there were lack of medicines. And why was there a lack of medicine? Because the pharmacy bill was not being paid. No pain medication, it didn't have insulin. These people were not getting that. These residents literally lacked a roof over their heads. And the photos show holes in the ceiling here in the Middle District of Georgia, rain coming down onto the residents. There was a smell of garbage. Why is that? Well, because the trash collector's bill had not been paid for so very long that trash was collecting all around the facility, and while the windows were open, it was coming into the residents' rooms. There just simply wasn't enough money. And juxtapose these issues against an owner who was building multi-million-dollar homes and investing more than $4 million in real estate. Well, this did not sit well with the court, and this particular individual was sentenced to over 20 years in prison and had to pay almost $7 million in fines. The last case involves a rural Mississippi nursing facility, and I raise this because for those of us who live in rural areas, there's particular vulnerability. Sometimes these residents don't have family members, the ombudsman are there for them, and sometimes they're just really far away, and the staff are harder to find and harder to keep. And as a result, sometimes these residents are particularly vulnerable and preyed upon. So in this particular case was a facility called Hyperion, for which the government recovered $1.25 million for a single facility. And in this facility, there are a number of major problems. Similar, in fact, to this Hauser case, but here these rural residents didn't really have too many other options in terms of nursing homes. So again, lack of food, lack of money, and lack of payment for staff. So I mentioned how important staffing is. In this particular facility, the staff would, the CNAs and directors of nursing and others, would get a check every couple of weeks, and only 50% of those checks would be covered by the bank, meaning half the checks would bounce. So what happened in this facility? Come Friday, people got their checks, they run to the bank to be first to get them, cash so they'd get their money. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, the residents are left unattended. Banks stopped, paying these checks. And so you ended up in a situation where individuals, there was one particular person who lost over 14 pounds in a matter of a few weeks. And this was alleged in our complaint. One woman had been complaining for some time about pain on her leg. So finally, a surveyor came in to look pulled down the sheet in rural Mississippi in the summer and found a snake wrapped around her leg. This is grossly substandard care in the United States, and it will not be permitted. The Nursing Home Initiative is committed to eradicating this kind of abuse and neglect in nursing homes. And so my message for you is, if you see anything that looks like this type of abuse, please make a call and protect those residents in both urban and rural areas. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Now, if not the biggest player in preventing these type of abuses, lies with Health and Human Services, OIG. So I want to ask Sandra about kind of the role that HHS OIG plays in the investigation and detecting this type of fraud. In particular, if you also follow up, because sometimes criminal prosecution is not possible, what are some of the remedies that HHS could seek to prevent some of these types of abuse?
Okay, thanks. I'm not sure that we have the largest role because we partner with the Department of Justice, U.S. Attorney's offices, and MFUCUs around the country, as well as many other people who have started investigations because they've reported fraud and abuse. And with that, I'd just like to mention that we have had for a long time a hotline for such reports, and it's 1-800-HHS-TIPS. So that's a fairly easy thing to remember. So it's 1-800-HHS-TIPS. So if any of you here have issues that you want to report that you think might lead to investigations that would be helpful, please don't hesitate to call that hotline. Also, I should say that on a lot of the things I'm going to be talking about here, corporate integrity agreements and various reports that our office submits and does in the area of patient abuse and neglect, they can be found on our website, which is oig.hhs.gov, oig.hhs.gov. The primary players in our investigation and detection of abuse is our Office of Investigations. We have investigators all over the country, offices all over the country, and they work very closely with our state MFUCUs and with the Department of Justice in their False Claims Act abuse cases. We also, in our Office of Counsel to the Inspector General, where I work in Washington, D.C., houses most of the lawyers, and we work to support the activities of both the Department of Justice in their investigation and our investigators. We also have some other arms which include the Office of Evaluation and Inspections and the Office of Audit Services. The Office of Evaluation and Inspection has done a number of reports on issues related to detecting abuse in nursing homes. For example, we did a report some time ago on the overutilization of drugs in nursing homes, a continuing challenge for all of us. And most recently, we did a report on unnecessary hospitalizations, which it's already been referred here as one of the ways in which people are neglected and abused. Our Office of Audit Services last summer published a resource guide that I think those of you who are here and are involved in issues of investigation and detection and would like to use the tools that are now available in terms of data analysis. This report is called a resource guide for using diagnosis codes in health insurance claims to help identify unreported abuse or neglect. It explains our approach to using data to identify incidents of potential abuse or neglect of vulnerable populations. So it can be used not only for nursing homes, but in other contexts as well. And again, that's available on our website. Our remedies. The primary remedy is that we have the authority to exclude individuals and entities from further participation in federal health care programs when they engage in unacceptable behavior, be it financial or abuse and neglect. The effect of that exclusion means that they cannot provide services, healthcare services in terms of furnishing them or ordering them, and if they were to do so, they would not be paid for by federal healthcare program benefits or payments. And what that means for a corporation is it's probably the equivalent of corporate death, because most corporations providing healthcare services at this point in this country really need to have the healthcare dollars that are available through federal healthcare programs. The purpose of exclusion, however, is really not intended to be punitive. It's intended to be remedial to both protect the public fisc and, most importantly, possibly would be to protect the program beneficiaries from be it financial fraud or fraud and abuse. We, in addition, can bring our own cases for civil monetary penalties. The exclusion remedy, I also should say that every year, and with a lot of the work that is done and actually started in Mafuku's, we exclude several thousand individuals and entities that have engaged in often criminal conduct that involves things like drug diversion, abuse and neglect of patients, and theft from patients. There are many instances in which we work on global resolutions with our U.S. Attorney's offices and the Department of Justice and Medicaid fraud control units. And these cases usually are the cases that are regional or national in nature. Many of these corporations are corporations that, in weighing what to do in the future, we don't think our beneficiaries are going to be best served by putting them out of business. So our goal instead is to not exclude, but to have these corporations enter into corporate integrity agreements, the purpose of which is to try to make them the kinds of healthcare providers that we can trust to not engage in fraud, and here in terms of what we're focusing on today, to not engage in fraud and abuse. And so a lot of the work that we do that we're particularly proud of and is corporate integrity agreements related to quality of care in nursing homes. Okay. And I'm told that I don't have any more time.
Yeah, but I do want to ask one last question before we close it out and bring it full circle. So I know the topic of this panel discussion is how to prevent abuse. So let me ask you and throw this question out to any of the panelists. You know, what is one thing that a loved one who has someone in a nursing home, if they feel that they're receiving bad care, what do they should? What should they do? What tips do you have? Anyone? Robin?
So first of all, I would encourage them to know what their rights are and to know, learn what good care is. Go to their care plan, raise the concerns there. You can have an ombudsman come with you. You could contact an ombudsman. You can also file a complaint with the state survey agency. So there are actually lots of directions that somebody could go, but we always encourage folks to try to raise the concern with the facility and talk about how can we work together to solve this problem.
And I would just add, I mean, if there's a severe case like I talked about a few moments ago, you can always call Adult Protective Services, which in many, and should be in all, nursing facilities, or their numbers are posted. You can call the HHS OIG hotline and report it and tell someone that something's happening to you.
Well, thank you. Would you join me in giving them a round of applause for such an informative panel?